start off with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. My name is John Scala, and I'm a member of the Warrington's Veterans Affairs Committee, and this is remembrances of 9/11. Oh, please sit down. It took me almost 20 years to go back and visit the site of the new World Trade Center. It was a bright sunny day as I walked by the water pools and then looking at the names of the victims that are inscribed in the plaza. It causes you to start recalling the events of that terrible day on September 11th. The mental images you thought you had forgotten start rolling back when you were there. In the silence of the Memorial Museum located below, you come face to face with those images with the countless photographs of that day. The faces of the victims, the scenes around Ground Zero, the crushed New York police, EMS, fire department trucks, and scattered piles of rubble. It's the sounds of the incessant screaming of the sirens that were amplified by the canyons in lower Manhattan. It's the crowds of people looking up, confused, talking, or screaming, with a combination of both shock and awe. It was so different witnessing it than re-seeing it on TV. I worked in lower Manhattan and in the World Trade Center for many years, and remember when the World Trade was being built and excavated in the early 70s. Part of it was walking through a maze of concrete and holes when you had to go down to the PATH trains in the very lowest level of the complex. In lighter times, I recalled seeing one questionable individual climbing up 1,400 feet on its vertical side to the top. Well, up in the top, we're waiting the Port Authority and New York Police Department for a trip to bring him to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. I remember seeing the daredevil that walked between the towers. And if you remember your old Superman show, look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, no, it's a nut. And again, Port Authority and New York Police Department were waiting to take him for his reserved ride to Bellevue. Then there was, of course, the huge King Kong. There was a prop actually laying in the plaza for about 2 weeks, and they were filming the final scenes of the remake of the King Kong movie. Now, almost 30 years later, I watched it come crashing down. Looking high up in the north side of the North Tower, and I was less than a quarter mile away, was this huge horizontal gash belching smoke, flame, and debris. It seemed to have stretched for the whole width of the tower. I remember watching the scores of first responders rush into the towers and seeing thousands of workers fleeing in all directions from the towers. The Port Authority and NYPD were hurriedly directing the hordes of people away from that immediate area. Many people don't know in those towers was 80,000 people that had to be evacuated. As the more units arrived to respond to the North Tower being struck, the South Tower was hit. I began seeing people jump to their deaths to escape the carnage below. One of the first recovered victims was the body of the fire department's chaplain. He was killed by a jumper landing on him from the upper floor. It was the day you instantly developed a sick feeling that many people would be losing their lives, and a day in your life that you would not forget. You just stood there gasping as the tragedy unfolded above and around. You quickly realized the enormity of the situation, the destruction and just the futility of going out of control. And then South Tower collapsed. The North Tower would only survive for about another half an hour. I recalled hearing the low rumbling of the floors that were collapsing and pancaking on top of one another. A gigantic cloud of dust, smoke, and what seemed endless, countless pieces of paper just blew up and flew in all directions. Things quickly turned from an awed crowd to a stampede to find shelter. A nearby pizza shop was my quick shelter, followed by dozens of other people ducking to find cover. With a roar, and the dust cloud was upon us quickly. It blotted out the sun. It was dark. And then what seemed forever, light began to appear. It was quiet at first. Then you heard the people in the store. Some were talking, some were crying, some were mumbling. They were just basically in shock. As it cleared a little more, some of the sounds you heard before began to return. In the background, a few sirens still mournfully wailed Everything else was probably crushed. Walking outside, using my shirt as cover for my eyes, nose, and mouth, I started to make my way downtown, occasionally looking back at the carnage. All around was a moonscape of papers, broken glass, and debris, which was all covered by a white thick coating of dust everywhere and everything. You quickly knew that many of the first responders had died. And things went from search and rescue to search and recovery. Two things I will never forget. The first was our local firehouse company, which was Ladder Company 3. We met them occasionally for building and safety code inspections and knew quite a few by their first name. That company of 19 men that day lost 11. The second was a sheet of paper. It was posted in a retail store months after 9/11. It had a picture of a young woman in a bridesmaid dress with a caption, "Have you seen Jennifer?" Almost 3,000 people were killed that day. The total of the first responders: New York Fire Department, 343 members. Law enforcement, which was the Port Authority, New York Police Department, and FBI was 75. EMS was 13. Writing this was probably one of the toughest speeches I ever had to do. I couldn't actually last more than a paragraph before I had to put the pen down. It's sort of like you think it's gone and it just comes back and it's still fresh in your head. Okay, my next speaker is going to be the EMS fire representative, and that will be Peter Scott. He's the VA chairman, committee chairman. Peter?
Rather hard to follow, to say the least. So this letter is from Lee Greenberg, Director of Emergency Services. We tended to plan this whole thing at the last minute. So we really didn't have enough warning for these guys to make it, so they sent us letters instead to be read. September 11th, 2022. Everyone, everywhere in the United States, good morning. First, I'd like to thank the Veterans Committee for both having this ceremony and allowing me to submit my thoughts. My words could never capture my true thoughts about that fateful day. Many of us remember where we were and what we were doing when that news was spread. For me, I had just finished up a night shift at the Center Square Fire Company. This isn't about me, though. This should be about the families, all the families, not just the families of the emergency personnel, but the families of the undeserving folks that were in the buildings in New York, Washington, D.C., and the flight that crashed in Shanksville. There are many things that go into being part of public safety. Hundreds of hours of formal training just to achieve baseline. Then there's a continued training for the rest of your career, regardless of volunteer or career status. The one group of people that do not receive training is our families. There's not training for the significant other or parent that answers the door to see people in uniform, ready to deliver the worst possible news. While the following thoughts make me sound like a martyr, I assure you that is not what I consider myself or my colleagues. When we take an oath or sign up to be a member of emergency services, there are certain aspects that are assumed but rarely mentioned. We assume the risk of being hurt or worse. We assume the risk of being permanently altered. But our families, while they may understand that might happen, they did not sign up for this. The folks and the families of the people in the building and on the ill-fated airplane previously mentioned did not sign up for the pain and suffering either. We have etched the phrase, never forget into our souls that sunny day in 2001. I also ask that you never forget not only the brave men and women who responded that day to all the incidents, but never forget the families that loved and supported those folks and still do today. Regardless of your politics, take comfort in knowing there are brave men and women that are willing to stand and protect you from harm. Fire, police, emergency medical services, and the military. I ask you always to remember their families as well. Remember they are people too, and have people that want them to be part of their lives for a long time to come. If the fateful day should come to any member of the emergency services, it is the families that will need your support more than ever. Sincerely, Lee Greenberg. Right. Recognizing the police department.
From the Warrenton Township Police Department. It's hard to believe it has been over 20 years since that fateful day in 9/11, and 3,000 people lost their lives due to an attack on America. After the initial attack, the initial shock wore off, our country rallied and stood strong against tyranny and began to heal and mourn the dead. Even today, after all this time, our brothers and sisters are still suffering from 9/11 cancers and other scars. Our brothers and sisters in law enforcement and the fire and EMS services in New York City have been and always will be in our thoughts and prayers. We can never forget that day, but we can move on with our lives and remember the fallen, lost, and missing souls. And they conclude with a Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God."
We'd like everybody to stand for a moment of silence. Approximately at 10:03 is when the last plane went down at Shanksville. And that was the one the passengers tried to take over the plane and made them crash, which was probably headed for Washington. And as I say, be about a minute, whatever your thoughts are. Thank you. We're going to end this ceremony with the playing of taps, which I think is apropos for all the first responders and the victims. concludes our ceremony. Thank you for coming.